This is a course in the book of Mark. Do you remember that? It's been 2 months. Mark hasn't gone anywhere, and so we're happy to come back and pick up where we left off, which is, as you may recall, just at the beginning of chapter 2. So chapter 1, if you remember, was giving us an introduction to that great theme in Mark of the authority of Christ. And then chapter 2 begins to show how the authority of Christ comes to be pitted against the authority of this world, especially the corrupt religious authority centered in Jerusalem. Jesus has what I've been calling charismatic authority. That is, it's the authority that is rooted in his person. He doesn't have a political office. He doesn't have some official capacity. But it's just that when he talks, people are moved. They're riveted by the weight of his words. That's charismatic authority. Bureaucratic authority is what you have if you're elected to an office, if you have some kind of official capacity. And that's what's going on in the second chapter of Mark as we see the two kinds of authority in conflict with each other. Nothing wrong with bureaucratic authority, but the problem is it can be abused. And in this case, it was being abused, and Jesus, in a sense, is attacking it. And these 5 stories give us at least 5 different angles on how that attack was proceeding. So we've looked at the first of those stories, which was the healing of the paralytic that was let down through the ceiling, you remember. And the second of them is what we find in Mark chapter 2, beginning at verse 13. Short story, filled with meaning. It is the calling of Levi. And that's as much as we're going to cover this morning. Starts at verse 13, chapter 2, the Word of God. Jesus went out again beside the sea. The whole crowd gathered around him, and he taught them. As he was walking along, he saw Levi, son of Alphaeus, sitting at the tax booth. And he said to him, "Follow me." And he got up and followed him. And as he sat at dinner in Levi's house, many tax collectors and sinners were also sitting with Jesus and his disciples, for there were many who followed him. When the scribes of the Pharisees saw that he was eating with sinners and tax collectors, they said to his disciples, "Why does he eat with tax collectors and sinners?" When Jesus heard this, he said to them, "Those who are well have no need of a physician, but those who are sick. I've come to call not the righteous, but sinners." And there's our text. Let's have a word of prayer and we'll get going. Our Father, we're grateful that you called a man like Levi, despised, an outsider, and yet you reached across that social divide and brought him into your inner circle of disciples. We thank you that he stands in some sense for what you've done with each of us, reaching across a divide to summons each of us into your presence. We give you thanks for it. We pray your blessing on our consideration of this story this morning, asking these things in the name of Christ. Amen. Well, just to remind you, I do this because I am OCD, you understand that, but I have to remind us of the big picture. Mark is in 2 major halves. First half, second half, divides pretty neatly right down the middle. The Caesarea Philippi confession really seems to demarcate the first and second half of Mark. The first half concerns Jesus in Galilee and its environs, that hinterland to the north on the other side of Samaria. Not much respected in the centers of power down in Jerusalem, but that's where Jesus gets underway. The second half, however, concerns Jerusalem, both Jesus' mission or journey to Jerusalem, and also, of course, Holy Week that takes place in Jerusalem, culminating in his crucifixion and resurrection. So we're in the first half of Mark. The first half has three sections. First is short, the prologue. John the Baptist baptizes Jesus. He's driven out into the wilderness. The second section, which is what we're dealing with right now, largely concerns Jesus' ministry in Galilee. So we're looking at that, and we'll come back to that in a moment. The third section of this first half is going to be when Jesus expands his activity outside of Galilee. This is not a neat distinction, but it will see a kind of shift in focus away from Galilee to regions that are more Gentile. So we're in the middle of this, the second of those, the longest of them. The first chapter of Mark, which is the first major piece of this section, concerns the authority of Christ. So we've looked at that. Jesus' authority is highlighted for us in two sort of flavors. It's Jesus' authority in his word, when he, by his mere word, drives out a demon. There's no negotiation, no contest. Heaven confronts hell, and hell loses on the spot. And then in the rest of chapter 1, we see a shift to Jesus' touch. So the authority of Jesus in word and touch is highlighted by Mark in chapter 1. This, in both instances, however, is characterized by cleansing. So when Jesus speaks, he drives out an unclean spirit. When he touches a leper, he's driving out an unclean disease. The idea that Jesus comes to clean house is really part of what Mark, I think, wants to get over to us in this first chapter. We're not surprised at that, because the last major thought concerning the coming Messiah, the coming messenger of the covenant in the Old Testament, highlights the point that he's going to come to clean up. So we go back to Malachi and this remarkable text. I don't know if John Frankhauser's in the room, but I always, every year at Messiah, love it when he sings these words from Malachi. Listen to them. Who can endure the day of his coming? Who can stand when he appears? For he is like a refiner's fire and like a launderer's soap. He's coming to clean up. He will sit as a refiner and purifier of silver. He will purify the sons of Levi and purge them as gold and silver, that they may offer to the Lord an offering in righteousness. Do you see that? That's the last major thing that is said about Messiah in the last book of the Old Testament. And then for 400 years, they're looking for some guy to come and clean house. And Jesus comes, and Mark doesn't want us to miss the point. He comes cleaning up things. An unclean spirit, an unclean disease driven out. Well, this authority that Jesus exercises simply in the heart of his inherent power comes into conflict. So the authority of Jesus in cleansing now becomes a series of stories about the authority of Jesus in conflict. 5 stories, usually called the conflict stories by commentators. Each of these stories highlights a weapon that is used by corrupt religious authority to keep people in bondage. In each case, Jesus launches a salvo against the weaponry of corrupted religious authority in this world. So what are those weapons? The story of the healing of the paralytic attacks the weapon of guilt. Corrupt authority wants to keep you feeling guilty. Martin Luther famously would go to the confessional booth. He'd confess his sins literally for hours on end to the Father Confessor. Not more than 15 feet outside the confessional booth, he was riddled with guilt once again. He never got that feeling that forgiveness was actually part of his experience, because it always seemed there was a price tag. Corrupt religious authority always attaches a price tag to forgiveness. Jesus offers it freely. The second weapon used by corrupt authority is contempt. The word contempt means or applies to things that have little or no value. And corrupt authority wants to say that there are some people in this world who have very little value, not really worth much attention, creating insiders and outsiders. And the call of Levi that we're looking at this morning highlights that in Jesus' mind, everybody has great worth, even those who seem by social standards to be the outsiders, those who are worthy of contempt. The third weapon is tradition. Corrupt authority always wants to keep you marching in straight lines, doing it the way we've always done it, and invariably it's the authority that controls the traditions by which we are to live our lives. Jesus says to the woman at the well, the days are coming when neither in this mountain or in Jerusalem will the true worshipers worship me. Those who worship will worship in spirit and in truth. There's a fresh breeze blowing, you see. New wine is being poured into new wineskins, and traditions don't deal with that very well. Corrupt authority prefers tradition to something new and refreshing and different. The fourth weapon is rules, regulations, legislation, pedantic requirements that go on and on and on. And that's what corrupt authority in the first century had done to the Sabbath. The Sabbath was supposed to be a day of rest, and it had become the most burdensome, wearisome day of the week. You dreaded the Sabbath because you knew there was a likelihood you'd do something wrong. You'd walk too far, pick up too much weight, engage in some activity that wasn't permitted. The possibilities of infraction on the Sabbath were astronomical, and people dreaded it. And corrupt authority likes to keep you in that position of feeling like you're always not measuring up to the new rules and the new regulations. The fifth one, servitude. Corrupt authority loves to create a slavish mentality among those who are under its authority. But Jesus says, I've come to serve and not to be served. He transforms the Sabbath. You know, all the 10 Commandments in the Old Testament are virtually repeated verbatim in the New Testament except for the Sabbath. It's treated differently. It doesn't go away, but Jesus turns the Sabbath from a day of kind of imposed and artificial rest into a day of holy, vigorous activity. Jesus says it is right to do good on the Sabbath, to do good, you see. And he creates a paradigm for Christian history that says the Sabbath is a day not to go into the office and bill a couple of hours, but to go out and engage in acts of service and charity and work in the community, to let that day of freedom be a day of holy activity that advances the kingdom and helps human beings in need. And so Jesus really re-engineers the Sabbath, and at the same time is attacking this fifth weapon of corrupt authority. So these 5 stories have a whole lot going on besides just little stories, you know, and each one of them has something of that character to it. Well, we're looking at the second of these, the calling of Levi. Then he went out again by the sea, and all the multitude came to him, and he taught them. He went out again by the sea. So just to remind you, in chapter 1, Jesus was on a tour. He was going through Galilee, the cities of Galilee, Sabbath by Sabbath, synagogue by synagogue, city by city. There are about 200 cities, 200 towns, communities, villages. I think he planned to hit every one of them until his train was derailed by a leper. Remember? The leper invades his space and begs Jesus to forgive him. I know you can, I don't know if you will. Yes. Jesus says, I am willing. He reaches out, he touches him. He says, be clean. Then he grabs the guy by the nape of the neck, yanks him up into his face and says, now look here, bud, don't you tell anybody about this. You know, it's very, very severe language, much more severe than it's normally translated. He warned him severely. Well, you would think the man would have taken a hint, but as one commentator said, he engaged in exuberant disobedience. And he went out and immediately, you see, began publishing the news of how Christ had healed him, and all bets were off. Crowds were gathering. The impediment of the crowd prevented Jesus from continuing his tour, so that at least impliedly in the text, Jesus decided to go back to Capernaum and let the dust settle for a while. That is the impression. It doesn't say that exactly, but that at least is the impression. So he's back in Capernaum. It's there in Peter's house that he heals this guy who's the paralytic. Now he goes out for a stroll along the shore there. Of course, Capernaum is a seacoast town, or a harbor city. Fishing and so on is going on. So he's out there and he's walking along, and as he does so, Mark says he taught them. Mark has a lot to say about Jesus' teaching. He doesn't have a lot to say about what Jesus taught. He really is interested in the fact that Jesus teaches. For Mark, teaching is important, and in some ways it's the very fact that he's teaching that is of most interest to him. There are exceptions, of course. We have plenty of teaching in Mark, but this is the point that Mark keeps highlighting, and at least it says for us the church needs teaching. You know, I consider it a huge honor to teach and to have such an auspicious crowd. And I look around here and I see a bunch of teachers. You're all teachers, aren't you? Many of you have taught classes in this church. You teach elsewhere. All of you are teaching in some ways. We're all teachers, and that's good. That's what the church is supposed to be. It's not more, it's not less than that, but it can be more than that, but it certainly has to be at least that it's a place where teaching is going on. The church has always valued teaching down through the centuries, and some of the greatest moments in the history of the church have been because there were teachers. An old saying that goes back to Constantinople in the early centuries of the church, quote, "Better the sun should not shine than Chrysostom should not preach," you see. A wonderful, eloquent theologian, pastor, preacher of the 3rd and 4th centuries, this man Chrysostom, and the church valued his teaching so much, and how many great teachers down through history have kept the church going in a good direction. So Jesus is establishing a paradigm here that has continued down through history to this day. As he passed by, he saw Levi, the son of Alphaeus, sitting at the tax office, and he said to him, "Follow me." So he arose and followed him. So Jesus passed by. He's teaching, but he's moving. Jesus is not a talking head, especially in Mark. There's an apocryphal gospel that many of you have heard of. It's called the Gospel of Thomas. It purports to be written by Thomas. It was considered by the early church and rejected as not worthy of canonicity. But it does borrow a lot of what Jesus said, incorporating it into its own text, and then it adds some other stuff which is a little bit beyond the scope, you know. But one thing interesting about the Gospel of Thomas is Jesus never does anything. He just talks. He's just a guru. But that's not the Jesus we run into in the Gospels. The Jesus in the Gospels is always moving, teaching, interacting. He's a man of action and compassion, as we've said. And so Mark gives that to us. He passed by, active, teaching, and as he does so, he saw a man named Levi, the son of Alphaeus, also known to us as Matthew. More than once in the New Testament, we have people with multiple names. Simon is also known as Peter. Saul is also known as Paul. Levi is also known as Matthew. Some think maybe Matthew was the name given to Levi by Jesus, and there's a possibility. The Bible never says it either way, so we don't know, but it's pretty clear this is the same guy, and this would be the man who is very probably the author of the gospel that goes by that name. More to the point, however, this character Levi is sitting at a tax office, a customs office, likely. Capernaum was on the border between Galilee, ruled by Herod Antipas, and Iturea, ruled by Herod Philip. Brothers, both sons of Herod the Great. They didn't like each other very much. You talk about a dysfunctional family, but that's another story. You know, here, these two guys have contiguous property, and of course, anytime you've got a border town, you've got an opportunity for taxes. Tariffs Various kinds of taxation were carried on there. And so we find Levi is there, and the impression you get, this is subtle, but in the text it seems to be, this was a major tax office. It wasn't just a guy sitting out with a booth, you know. This was probably a structure. It may have had offices, and at least again you get the impression Levi may have been one of the main, or maybe the main administrator of this tax office, because there apparently were many other tax collectors who were working in and around this same area. So it may have been a fairly major kind of operation that's going on here. But of course, what we usually think of with tax collectors in the Bible in the first century is that nobody liked them. So Mark is here emphasizing the idea that here's a man who is socially undesirable, unlike really Simon and Andrew, who were the first two disciples, or James and John, the second two, hard-working, kind of blue-collar types out there earning an honest living. Now we have a very different species of character who comes along, and it's this character, Levi. These men who were tax collectors were public contractors. That's why they were called publicans. They obtained the authority to engage in tax collecting activity by purchasing a license to do so. They were Jewish people. I think you all know this. They had to have a certain degree of wealth going into the plan because they had to have enough wealth to buy this license. So the license that was obtained by the publicans gave them the authority to collect taxes and to collect a commission. And the commission was not necessarily well defined, so that they could collect, depending on the wherewithal of the person from whom they were collecting, a little or a lot. And that's how they made their living. And some of them made a very good living. And of course, the good living they made tended to stand in sharp contrast to the, in some cases, grinding poverty of those from whom they were extracting their taxes. So that in itself did create a certain degree of understandable hostility. This hostility was complicated by the fact that these were Jewish people. If they'd been foreigners, it might have been a little bit easier to deal with. But these are Jewish people, therefore viewed as turncoats and traitors. You can imagine if, heaven forbid, America would be taken over, let's say, by some Middle Eastern country, and we were occupied in every major city. And then we saw some of our fellow Americans selling out to these who had occupied and becoming the mechanism of oppression and exploitation. We wouldn't like them much, would we? We would have more hostility toward them than we would toward the occupying force, because they're traitors. And that's the way these folks, these tax collectors, were viewed. And so when we hear that Levi was a tax collector, at least in our minds we need to let all of that hostility and resentment rise in our imaginations. They were legalized extortionists. They were despised and hated. One commentator on the status of tax collectors in the first century Israel made this comment. He said, "A Jew who collected taxes was disqualified as a judge or witness in court, expelled from the synagogue, and a cause of disgrace to his family. The touch of a tax collector rendered a house unclean. Jews were forbidden to receive money or even alms from tax collectors, since revenue from taxes was deemed robbery. The Talmud listed tax collectors with gamblers with dice, usurers, and certain others among those who were disqualified from serving as legal witnesses or judges because of their presumed dishonesty. The Talmud extended the taint to the family. This is called in the law the taint of blood. So the Talmud says this, but this shows you that there is not a family containing a tax collector in which they are not all tax collectors, or containing a robber in which they are not all robbers, because they protect him. So, Get an impression in your mind. This man was well-to-do, hated and despised. And all of those with him shared a common kind of reputation. Well, you can imagine the gasps that spread through the group that was following Jesus when he's walking along, and they thought when he saw the tax office, he was going to walk the opposite direction, as they say, walk on the other side of the street to avoid this despicable operation. And in fact, they are horrified when Jesus not only doesn't walk away, he walks right up to the place, looks at maybe the chief bureaucrat of the joint, looks him in the eye and says, "Follow me." And everybody seeing that must have been aghast that Jesus would do such a thing. So again, we see the cleansing authority of Christ highlighted, at least impliedly here, as Jesus reaches out, giving free and indeed irresistible grace packaged in that call, "Follow me," to a man named Levi. And I just have to say to you as a footnote, every one of us in this room who has heard the call of Jesus, "Follow me," was another Levi. And heaven was probably aghast when we were called. But here we are. Thank the Lord for that. Well, Levi is the fifth disciple to be called. As I say, he's better known as Matthew. The word Matthew means gift of Yahweh. And that's why some think maybe Jesus retooled his name and gave him this new one, but as I say, the Bible never says that in so many words. All right, scene 2. Scene 1, he's on the coast there. Now, a little later, maybe the same day, more likely a couple of days later, as it happened, he was dining in Levi's house. Many tax collectors and sinners also sat together with Jesus and his disciples. For there were many, and they followed him. So again, it implies to us this was not just an isolated little operation. This may have been a major kind of tax collecting enterprise, and there may have been quite a few who were involved, maybe even under Levi's administration. They're dining at Levi's house. This is a going away party thrown by Levi in honor of Levi, you know. This is his moment to say, "Guys, I'm going a new direction." And you do get the impression this was a pretty lavish celebration. Luke actually says in his version of the story that Levi threw a great feast. You get the feeling he just pulled out the stops. A lot of that money that he'd accumulated, he just spends it lavishly. A huge party in honor of Jesus. But who do you invite to your party if you're a tax collector? The only people you can invite are people who share the same lousy reputation that you do, though they're the only friends you've got. So he wants to throw a big party, and he invites the only people who would come, other tax collectors and sinners. Whenever I read this, a movie, one of the few that I'd actually recommend to you, some of you have seen it, I'm sure, it's called Babette's Feast. Have you ever seen it? It's an amazing movie, clearly allegorical of Christ himself, but in the movie, Babette, who's a wonderful French cook, chef, you know, throws an elaborate feast in a tiny little town and invites all the people who were there, and it was the most lavish experience they'd ever had in their lives. And I kind of get the feeling that's what Levi's pulling off here. He just pulls out the stops. A great party is thrown, and all of these people come. And in some ways, this represents a kind of benchmark moment in which Levi's professional career of being a getter becomes the inauguration of a career of being a giver. If Levi had never been called by Jesus, none of us would ever have heard of him. He would just be in the dust heap of history. But do you know what? This moment of change makes him one of the most famous people in all of human history. He wrote the very first book that we find in the New Testament, Matthew. And to this day, we have St. Matthew's cathedrals, St. Matthew's churches, St. Matthew's this and that all around the world, because this man who was so despised and rejected, so contemptible by the standards of that day, had received a call from Jesus, "Follow me." And everything changed, and it began with this feast. Levi threw a feast. You eat at feasts. Jesus, I was just thinking about this. How much of Jesus' ministry involves food? I love it. You know, it's just great. He is not a phantom floating around, kind of like a spirit that you can sort of see through, you know, not really real, not really. He eats, and he likes to eat, and he hangs out with people that eat, and you find that is peppered through the Gospels. He feeds 5,000 people. He leads the disciples, you know, through a cornfield, and they're eating. He eats at the homes of Pharisees and others. We find this constantly popping up, that Jesus eats. And there's something about the stories, many of them of Jesus eating, that of course highlights what a sacred thing this is. Because many times we hear that before the meal, he takes the bread, he takes the food, he lifts it up, he gives thanks. He makes this moment somehow sacred, somehow sacramental. And from that time to this, we as Christians pray before we eat, and we feel that eating together has a kind of intimacy to it. It's no surprise that the most deep, profound, significant, sacred moment of Christian worship is a meal in which Jesus invites us to eat and to join in that kind of intimate fellowship with him. So this is only the first of many we're going to run into in Mark. But who's there eating? It's the tax collectors and the sinners. That's what is shocking to us. We've talked about tax collectors already. The word sinners, hamartoloi, the Greek word, is a kind of generic term that was applied in the first century, not necessarily to people who were notoriously awful people, but it was rather to what you might call Israelites who had given up. It's something like, you who've studied some economics know that, you know, we have published ever so often unemployment numbers, you know. So many people are employed, 4%, 5%, 6% are unemployed. But economists will tell you that 6% is not the whole story. Those are people who are still looking for work, and are therefore making it to the statistical radar screen to be counted as unemployed. But then economists will tell you there's a whole class of people who are called discouraged workers. They've given up. They tried and they just couldn't find a job, and finally they drop off the radar screen. And that's another significant population of people that don't even make the statistical counting. In some ways, something like that was happening in first century Israel. You had, first of all, people who actually believed, if you can believe this, that they were living perfectly what the law required. They believed they were perfect. There were people like that. They believed that they were doing everything that the law required indefectibly. It seems that that young man that came to Jesus and said, "What must I do to have eternal life?" Jesus says, "Well, keep the law." And he said, "Oh, I've done that. That's easy. Anything else I got to do? Or am I good?" You know. There were people who thought that. Then there were another class of people who were trying, like Avis. You know, we try harder. They kept trying and hoping that someday they were going to achieve perfection. And then there were a lot of people who just said, "I'm never going to make it." They'd given up. Why try? The bar's too high, the standard's too exacting. I can't do it. These people were generically referred to in polite society in ancient Israel as sinners. And so they had all kinds of different individual stories. Some were more notorious than others. But in a sense, all of them were in that class of people who just despaired. They just given up. And it must have been quite a sight if you'd been standing, 50 yards away and seeing this. I want you to imagine. I want to keep this as polite as I can, but I want you to get the point. Let's imagine you're walking in downtown Spokane. And there's kind of an outdoor restaurant area. It's summertime, everything's nice. And you look over into kind of a courtyard area, and you see a whole bunch of people being pretty noisy. And your impression as you look at them is, these are people I'm not sure I'd want to hang out with. And the closer you look, you see, you recognize immediately. There's prostitutes there, there's pimps there, there's drug dealers there, there's people who are involved in gang activity there, there's kind of a criminal element there. There's a lot of people that you just go, whoa, And then you happen to see right in the middle of the group, hanging out with them, carrying on visiting, is the senior pastor of First Presbyterian Church, Spokane. Now, I just want you to be honest with me. What would go through your mind? I suppose some of us, the more enlightened in the room, I'm not including myself here, would say, oh, isn't that good? Look at the ministry he's having. But I think some of us might be a little bit put off by such a sight. And that's exactly, only on steroids, what happened when people looked into a courtyard of a guy named Levi and saw all of these people of such dubious reputation, and there's Jesus right in the middle of them, and he's just with them. Christian history at its best moments has had for its heroes people who scandalized polite society. George Whitefield in England scandalized polite Anglican society because he preached outside. People thought, wait a minute, sermons are only supposed to happen in nice, sacred precincts with stained glass windows. And it's only supposed to take place with people who are nicely spit-polished and look good and are behaving themselves and are singing hymns appropriate. What is this George Whitefield doing going outside of these places? He's preaching to coal miners. He's preaching to the dregs of society. He's going to places where, what in the world is he doing there? And they were shocked that George Whitefield would do such a thing. And yet in some ways he was one of the principal causes of what's sometimes called a Great Awakening in England, because he dared risk scandal to preach to those people who were held in contempt. William Carey, similarly, proposes to take the gospel to a place which was simply viewed as a money machine, India, where people lived in religious darkness, and he said, I think we should take them the gospel. The British East India Company didn't dig that very much. They were afraid it might enlighten those folks. One elder statesman in the Baptist church where Carey was a member said, sit down, young man. God can take care of those people on his own, That was the attitude. But William Carey wouldn't take no for an answer. He scandalized his religious peers. St. Francis of Assisi looked at Jesus in the Bible and saw him going out into the highways and byways, and then he looked at the religious types of his day and saw that they all lived in monasteries. Holed up, cloistered communities, not getting their hands dirty, and St. Francis said, wait a minute. We should be going out into the communities, and he scandalized the people of his day. Even the Pope said, get out of here, kid, what are you doing? This is crazy. Until the Pope had a vision that made him change his mind. In other words, my point is, Jesus sets once again here a paradigm for what the church has been at her best, when at the time many people thought she was at her worst. The irony of ministry to those who are held in contempt. Well, there they are. They sat together with Jesus and his disciples. No indication here that Jesus is teaching or preaching. This is not a Bible study, a home fellowship kind of, he's just there. That's the impression Mark wants us to have, is that he's simply enjoying this feast with these social undesirables, enjoying their company. And of course that precipitates a bit of a crisis. When the scribes and Pharisees saw him eating with tax collectors and sinners, they said to his disciples, how is it that he eats with tax collectors and sinners? It's just appalling. We've talked about the scribes way back when. I won't spend time, except you know that they were kind of the scholar class of Jewish society. Many of them were Pharisees. We haven't talked a lot about the Pharisees yet, so I wanted to use this as an excuse to say a couple of things about them. And let me warn you up front, I have not come to bury them, but at least to some degree to praise them. They get a bad rap, and I want to rehabilitate them slightly. So just brace yourself. First of all, your Greek lesson for the morning. The word Pharisee, you can almost sound it out, can't you? Pharisaios, comes from a Greek verb, aphorizo, which means to separate or to divide. The historical origins of the Pharisees go back to the mid-2nd century BC, at a time when a great deal of Jewish society was drifting away from her traditional moorings. Secularism, paganism, Hellenism were having increasing influence in the culture of Israel, and it seemed in many people's minds that it was losing its way, and the Pharisees, well-intentioned people, got together and said, we need to separate ourselves from this drift into godlessness. We need to live by a better standard and do so conspicuously so that people will see this is what the Jewish religion is really all about. And so they kind of banded together, forming an informal sort of organization in which they essentially made promises that they would live as best they could according to the classic Jewish law coming down from Moses, with their own understanding of how it was to be applied in particular details in life. The Pharisees were a voluntary society. Nobody was forced to become a Pharisee, but when you joined, you made promises to live in strict obedience to God's law. It was a lay organization. There was no hierarchy. They didn't have grand poobahs of the Pharisees, you see. Members would address each other in a kind of egalitarian spirit, merely as friend. Anyone could join the Pharisees. All you had to do so was to make promises to, again, live by this standard, and you made the promise in the presence of 3 other Pharisees, and you're in. It was egalitarian. There was no distinction in this group between the educated and the uneducated. Everybody was considered equal. Even women were Pharisees. The Bible doesn't teach us that, but we have some significant evidence from Josephus and others that there were actually female Pharisees. So it was even egalitarian in a rather unexpected way. It was an open organization. It was not a secret society. You didn't have to learn a secret handshake, secret password, the speakeasy kind of thing, with smoke-filled rooms and private meetings. It was open. It was out public. And that was the way, and that was their intention. They wanted to be visible. It was rooted in Jewish middle class. So some Pharisees were well-to-do, but not all. But it did account for some of the tension the Pharisees had toward the Sadducees, which tended all of them to be very wealthy and tended to be connected to the temple and its revenue stream. The Pharisees, not so much. The Pharisees, it may surprise you to know, were very popular. They were highly esteemed among the masses of Jewish people in the first century. They were regarded as people worthy of a high degree of respect. And so even though we tend to recoil from the word Pharisee, and most of us would not be complimented if someone called us a Pharisee, it was not that way in the first century. This was regarded kind of a high calling, a high station. The Pharisees were Torah-centric. Going back to the time of the exile, when the Jewish religion had to redefine itself a little bit, the temple was gone, the Torah came in to more or less become the center of Jewish religious life. The temple eventually was rebuilt, so you had kind of 2 strands of Jewish faith, Torah-centric, temple-centric. The Pharisees, more than anyone else, were the ones who were the sort of trustees of this Torah-centric religious faith of the Jewish people, and that is the reason why, probably more than any other single factor, that we continue to have identifiable Jewish people and a Jewish religion to this day. The Sadducees did not survive when the temple was destroyed and when a Jewish revolt was put down in 135 AD. So the destruction of the temple, 70 AD, and then the second punch, 135, and that was the end. That was the end of Israel. That was the end of any idea of a population in Palestine. Jewish people were spread throughout the world. The Sadducees disappeared. The Zealots disappeared. The Essenes at the Dead Sea area disappeared. Other subgroups of Jewish society disappeared. The only group that survived were the Pharisees. and those who began to attach themselves to them. So we can thank the Pharisees that to this day we have Jewish people in the world, because they were Torah-centric. They were hanging on to the Scriptures, you see. So we have this remarkable kind of group of people who, at least to some degree, deserve a little bit of esteem. They get a lot of bad press, of course, and popular references, and even the New Testament seems to treat them rather harshly. But the New Testament has some good things to say about the Pharisees too. One of which is that they took Jesus the most seriously. They shared the same fundamental outlook as Jesus. So they saw in him something of a common spirit. And that may have been part of what provoked such a crisis among the Pharisees with respect to Jesus. Jesus, on more than one occasion, is in the home of a Pharisee, eating with Pharisees. He hangs out with them to some degree. We get the impression from the New Testament that he kind of won their grudging respect, you know. Nicodemus comes to Jesus by night. He's a Pharisee. We know you are a teacher sent from God. Nobody could do these miracles unless God were with him. There was a recognition among them that this man had something of God's sanction in his life. The book of Acts tells us that many early converts to Christianity were Pharisees. They had fought him tooth and nail, but eventually came to realize this was the very one that the Jewish religion had been looking forward to throughout the years. One of the most controversial statements I came across studying this is that some have argued with a straight face that they think Jesus himself was a Pharisee. I'm not teaching you that, and I don't really quite believe it, but it's possible. It's a hypothetical possibility, and if so, that would account for the great interest that these people took in him, because they keep telling him he's violating the rules. But the rules he's violating are not the rules generally applicable to Jewish people. They're the rules of the Pharisees. That's what they're accusing him of. You're violating our rules. And that would only make sense if Jesus were one of them. Now, again, I'm not saying that, so don't, you know. But anyway, I heard that argument made, and it was rather compelling at the time. So just for whatever you think of it. So anyway, if the Pharisees were set apart, if they were people who were going to distinguish themselves, then you can imagine the trauma that would be provoked when here Jesus is eating with tax collectors and sinners, doing the very opposite of what Pharisees at least would have viewed as appropriate. So the critics approach. They don't approach Jesus directly. They kind of approach the disciples who were there as well. I kind of imagine approaching a maitre d' at a restaurant, you know. They want to just ask this guy on the side. They didn't dare confront Jesus directly, but the disciples are kind of vulnerable. They're probably a little embarrassed being connected with these tax collectors and sinners, and yet they can't help it. They're followers of Jesus. What else can you do? And now they're put on the defensive by these questions that are being put to them, and they're kind of caught in this squeeze play between the two. Well, Jesus, of course, when he heard it, said to them, "Those who are well have no need of a physician, but those who are sick. I did not come to call the righteous, but sinners to repentance." He said to them. Interesting dispute as to who are the them here. Many think it's the disciples. He said these words to the disciples in the spirit of not throwing his pearls before swine, necessarily, the Pharisees at that point, not deeming the Pharisees worthy of this instruction. That's a possibility. My own view is a little bit, I think, more in this direction, that he's actually saying it not only to the disciples, but also to the Pharisees, and hoping in some ways that this little dig is going to get some of them to begin to see the misguided understanding that they have of their own righteousness. He says, those who are sick are the ones that need a physician. Of course, the unspoken but obvious premise of this is that all of us are sick. But some of us don't know it, you know. People who are sick and know it go to the doctor. People who are sick and don't know it stay home. And Jesus came for people who were sick and who knew it. It's interesting, of course, that it's not hard when you go out and talk to folks who are kind of down and out in their luck. Many times they'll very readily acknowledge their disease. They'll acknowledge their failings, maybe much more readily than some who are in happier stations of life. All right, so my Sunday school lesson, friends, for the morning. We've seen three kinds of people in this story. We've seen Pharisees, we've seen sinners, and we've seen disciples. Who do you identify with? Are you a Pharisee? Pharisees are not bad people. I think Presbyterians and Pharisees have a lot in common, So this is not a bad thing if you think, yeah, I kind of see myself. Especially when we see some of the good aspects of the Pharisee life. I kind of see myself there. There's always a temptation, however, and this is the Pharisee vulnerability, to take a little pride in achievement. Well, look what I've done. Look how I'm living my life. Look at the evidence of, success. And to, by that, begin to view others with a certain degree of contempt, you see. So that for us is the little lesson we need to tuck away. Maybe you see yourself in this story as one of the sinners. Not a notoriously wicked person, but someone that's just kind of given up. We all know people who seem to be so wonderful in their faith, and I look at them and I think, I can't even come close to that. That person is so far ahead of me, and there's almost a feeling of despairing, Some have given up. If you are not one of those people, I guarantee you know one of those people. Despairing of ever being good enough to join the club. I have a close friend. I try to drag him to church. I tell you, he said it to me in so many words. I'm just not good enough. Get out of here, man. What do you mean you're not good? None of us are good enough. Get on the bus. Come on down. Oh, I don't know. I just don't feel right down there. You know what the first thing he'll say? He'll say how those people dress and the nice cars they drive. He doesn't have nice clothes. He doesn't have a nice car. And he feels outclassed. I'm not saying this to yell at you. I'm saying it to yell at myself, I guess. But do you know how many other people, how many times we could replicate that story? People who are sinners, and they've given up. Maybe you identify with the disciples, caught in the middle. Awkwardly aligned with Jesus. We're going where for dinner? You got to be to Levi's house? I thought we called him away from... And now here they are. You can just feel the sweat running down their brow as they're surrounded by all of these people of dubious reputation. And just when they're feeling so uncomfortable, so traumatized by the general environment anyway, here comes a couple of Pharisees to say, what are you doing here? What is this? What do you say to a question like that? How do you respond to something like that? That's a heresy detector. Awkwardly caught in the middle. Have you ever been embarrassed by the Christian cause? Have you ever been embarrassed by the message of Christ and His purposes in this world? Have you ever felt like you have to be defensive? All right, hang in there. Ship is going down, but we're almost done. True discipleship, which I hope can apply to every one of us here, involves righteousness, listen to me, that exceeds the righteousness of the scribes and Pharisees. Matthew tells us that. It exceeds it because it is driven by a humble recognition that this is God's grace and I deserve no credit, period, for any good that may be done in my life. And as soon as we are there, we are close to a righteousness that exceeds the righteousness of the scribes and Pharisees. It is so because it includes knowledge that each of us, as Paul says elsewhere, is the chief of sinners. Paul says that, I read that, I roll my eyes. What do you mean, Paul, you're the chief of sinners? Give me a break, But do you realize, from the point of view of a Christian person on the road of sanctification, that's how you feel sometimes. I'm the chief of sinners. The closer we get to holiness, the more striking is the contrast. between what God calls us to and who I am. But it's in that state of mind of living a life of righteousness for which I can take no credit, knowing that but for the grace of God, there go I, when I look at folks who seem to be so miserable in their circumstances, that I can live in a kind of joyful abandonment to God's grace, extending joyful grace to those who others have abandoned. And that really, I think, is the balance that this story is calling us to, and the reason that we can, under the influence of God's grace, not hold anyone in contempt.